I bought the mountain house because it felt untouched by noise and interference. It sat above the valley, surrounded by tall pines, with a narrow road leading up like a filter that kept the world out. When I signed the papers, I believed I was buying privacy as much as property. The realtor talked about views and seasons, but what sold me was the silence. No traffic, no crowds, just space, air, and the sense that whatever happened there would be on my terms. For the first few weeks, everything confirmed that belief. I left the house exactly as it was when I bought it, a deep forest green that blended into the mountainside. Neighbors waved occasionally, polite but distant. There was an HOA, technically, but they were barely mentioned during closing. I was told they handled road maintenance and snow removal, nothing intrusive. I paid the dues, filed the paperwork, and didn't think about them again. Because the house wasn't my primary residence, I wasn't there all the time. I'd come up for long weekends, then head back to the city. Before one trip, I locked up as usual, took photos for my own records, and drove down the mountain without a second thought. It was just another routine departure, uneventful and forgettable. When I returned 2 weeks later, something felt wrong before I even parked. The house stood out in a way it never had before. Instead of blending into the trees, it looked sharp against them, almost exposed. As I got closer, the reason became obvious. The entire exterior had been repainted. Bright, uniform, and completely unfamiliar. It was a color I hadn't chosen, hadn't approved, and wouldn't have considered. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake. Maybe the light was different. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. I walked around the house slowly, touching the siding, confirming what my eyes already knew. Fresh paint. Clean edges. No weathering. Someone had been there recently, and they hadn't asked. I checked the door. No signs of forced entry. Inside, nothing was disturbed. That somehow made it worse. Whoever did this had treated my house like a project, not a home. Like something they had the right to modify, without my consent. Standing there, keys still in my hand, I felt confusion give way to a quiet, unsettled anger. The first email came within an hour. A cheerful message from the HOA welcoming me back and informing me that the exterior repaint had been completed in accordance with community standards. They thanked me for my cooperation, as if I had agreed to any of it. There was no question mark, no explanation, just an assumption. I reread the message several times, waiting for the part where this became a misunderstanding. It never came. As the reality settled in, one thought became clear. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision made while I was gone, based on the belief that I wouldn't push back. And as I stood there looking at a house that no longer looked like mine, I realized this was only the beginning of something much bigger than paint. The silence around the house suddenly felt different, heavier, like it was waiting. I could sense that someone had crossed a boundary they assumed was flexible. They had acted quickly, confidently, and without hesitation. Whatever rules they thought they were enforcing, they had done it without ever speaking to me. And that quiet certainty, more than the color on the walls, told me this situation was not going to resolve itself politely or quickly, either. The next few days were a blur of emails, documents, and unanswered questions. I started by rereading every HOA document I'd been given at closing, looking for the clause that supposedly gave them permission to repaint my house without notice. I expected to find something buried in fine print, some vague language I'd overlooked. What I found instead was silence. There were rules about maintenance standards, about keeping properties in good repair, about submitting plans for exterior changes. There was nothing about the HOA making those changes themselves, and certainly nothing about doing it while an owner was away. I replied to the HOA's message carefully, keeping my tone neutral. I asked who had authorized the repaint, under what provision, and why I hadn't been notified. The response came quickly, but it didn't answer much. They explained that the previous color was non-compliant with updated community aesthetics and that the board had voted to bring it into alignment. They framed it as routine, even helpful, emphasizing how fortunate I was that they'd handled it efficiently. That word, efficiently, stuck with me. It suggested they saw this as a convenience, not a violation. as if ownership were conditional, subject to their interpretation of what fit. I pushed back, pointing out that no notice had been given and no consent obtained. This time, the reply was firmer. They cited community harmony, long-term value, and their responsibility to act when owners failed to comply. Failed to comply with what? They never specified. As the exchange continued, the tone shifted. Polite explanations turned into warnings about fines if I repainted it back without approval. They reminded me of my obligations as a member of the association, subtly reframing the situation as if I were the one out of line. The more they wrote, the clearer it became that they weren't interested in discussion. They expected acceptance. Neighbors began to weigh in indirectly. One mentioned, casually, that the board had talked about my house while I was gone, describing it as an eyesore that needed to be addressed before summer. Another warned me that the HOA didn't like resistance and had a habit of acting first and justifying later. None of this made me feel better. It confirmed that the repaint wasn't an isolated overstep. It was part of a pattern. I asked for documentation. Meeting minutes. Notices. Any record showing I'd been informed. Days passed without an answer. In the meantime, another email arrived reminding me that altering the exterior again without approval could result in penalties. It was surreal. They had changed my house without permission, and now they were warning me not to change it back. Despite the growing frustration, I stayed measured. I didn't threaten legal action. I didn't accuse them outright. I wanted a clean record, one that showed escalation coming from their side alone. But privately, something had shifted. This wasn't about color preference or aesthetics anymore. It was about control exercised in my absence, based on the assumption that distance meant compliance. Standing on the deck one evening, looking at the freshly painted walls catching the last light, I realized the HOA hadn't just crossed a line. They'd done it deliberately, counting on the fact that I wasn't there to stop them. And if they were comfortable doing that once, there was no reason to believe they wouldn't do it again. The question was no longer how to complain, but how to make sure it couldn't happen twice. I decided to stop arguing about what they had already done and start focusing on how they were allowed to do it in the first place. Emotion wasn't going to undo fresh paint. Authority would. The key was figuring out which authority actually mattered. The HOA spoke confidently, but confidence doesn't equal jurisdiction. Somewhere between their emails and their assumptions, there had to be a limit they'd ignored. I began with the county records, building permits, zoning rules, environmental regulations. Mountain properties come with layers of oversight most people forget about, especially associations that operate as if their rules exist in a vacuum. Within an hour, I found something interesting. Exterior modifications, including repainting, required a permit if the property fell within certain scenic and environmental overlays. My house did. The color restrictions weren't just aesthetic preferences. They were tied to erosion control, glare reduction, and visual impact on protected land. The HOA hadn't just repainted my house without permission. They had done it without a permit. That realization changed everything. I printed the relevant sections, highlighted the language, and double-checked with the county office to be sure I wasn't misreading it. The clerk confirmed it calmly, almost casually. Any exterior repaint in that zone required owner authorization and a filed permit. Unauthorized work could result in fines, stop work orders, and mandatory remediation. It didn't matter who ordered the work. Responsibility followed the action. I asked a simple question. If an HOA does it, the answer was immediate. Then the HOA is in violation. Armed with that, I stopped responding to the HOA's emails altogether. Instead, I filed a formal inquiry with the county, attaching photos of the repaint, timestamps showing when I was out of town, and copies of the HOA's messages admitting they'd ordered the work. I didn't accuse. I didn't editorialize. I let the documents speak for themselves. The response from the county came faster than anything the HOA had ever sent me. An inspector was assigned. A review was opened. Within days, a notice was issued. Not to me, but to the association. Unauthorized exterior modification. Failure to obtain permit. Work performed without property owner consent. Each line was precise, unemotional, and devastating. That's when the tone from the HOA changed. The next email wasn't confident or congratulatory. It was cautious. They said there may have been a procedural oversight and asked if I'd be willing to discuss a resolution. They suggested working together to address any compliance concerns. The shift was almost physical, like watching someone realize they'd stepped onto unstable ground. I didn't reply right away. I waited until the official notice was delivered. When it was, the HOA received a deadline to respond, documentation to provide, and potential penalties outlined in plain language. Suddenly, their authority had limits again. Real ones. Neighbors noticed the change before I said anything. The board meeting that month was unusually quiet. No talk of enforcement. No reminders about community standards. Just procedural updates and deferred items. The house, my house, was no longer a topic. Standing there, reading the notice one more time, I felt something settle. Not triumph, exactly. More like clarity. The HOA hadn't repainted my house because they were right. They'd done it because they thought they could. All it took to stop them wasn't a fight, but a reminder that their power only existed within boundaries they'd forgotten to respect. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in stages, each one quieter than the last, but heavier in implication. The HOA didn't argue with the county. They couldn't. The notice was clear, and their own emails had already documented their involvement. Instead, they shifted into damage control mode, trying to contain a problem they had created without admitting fault. Their next message was carefully worded. They acknowledged the county inquiry and stated they were cooperating fully. They avoided mentioning permits, consent, or violations. Instead, they framed the repaint as a misunderstanding rooted in good intentions. Community standards, visual consistency, long-term value. The same phrases as before, now stripped of confidence and padded with caution. What they wanted, it became obvious, was my participation in smoothing things over. They asked if I would be willing to sign a retroactive approval so they could apply for an after-the-fact permit. They suggested this would simplify the process for everyone. In other words, they wanted me to help fix the problem they'd caused by pretending it had my blessing all along. I declined. Politely. Briefly. I told them any permit application would need to reflect the truth, including the fact that the work had been done without my authorization while I was out of town. I didn't threaten. I didn't lecture. I just refused to rewrite history for their convenience. That's when the pressure stopped completely. No more reminders. No more suggestions. No more talk of compliance or harmony. The HOA's presence in my inbox evaporated almost overnight. The board meeting minutes, which I'd started reading out of curiosity, showed a sudden change in focus. Landscaping contracts, budget approvals, snow removal schedules. My house was absent from the agenda. The county process continued without drama. An inspector visited, took photos, and confirmed the repaint didn't meet the original approved color profile for the area. The HOA was given two options: restore the exterior to its prior compliant color at their expense or submit a new permit request with full owner consent and environmental review. Either way, the decision was no longer theirs alone. Neighbors began to approach me quietly. Not confrontationally, but with a kind of cautious curiosity. One admitted the board had assumed I wouldn't notice right away. Another said they'd been surprised by how fast the county responded. A few thanked me, indirectly, for pushing back. Apparently, I wasn't the first person the HOA had overstepped with. I was just the first one who hadn't backed down. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative flipped. Before, the HOA acted as if repainting my house was a favor. Now, they were careful to distance themselves from the decision, speaking about it as if it were an unfortunate administrative error. No one took responsibility, but no one defended it either. The confidence was gone. Eventually, a final notice arrived from the county. The HOA elected to restore the original color. They scheduled the work, this time with written notice, documentation, and an apology that stopped just short of actually saying the word. I didn't need it. The correction itself was enough. Watching the house return to the way it had been felt oddly anticlimactic. There was no victory speech, no confrontation, No dramatic reversal. Just paint, quietly removed and replaced. The mountain backdrop absorbed the house again, the way it always had. It looked like mine. The lesson became clear in that stillness. Authority thrives on assumption, on silence, on the belief that people won't check, won't question, won't escalate beyond angry emails. The HOA hadn't counted on permits, or counties, or paper trails. They'd counted on distance and inconvenience doing the work for them. Standing there, I realized this wasn't just about stopping them once. It was about resetting expectations permanently. They now knew that my absence didn't equal access, and that ownership didn't dissolve just because a board decided it should. Whatever rules they enforced going forward, they would do it carefully. And that, more than any apology, was the real resolution. By the time everything was finished, the mountain house felt quiet again in the way that first drew me to it. Not the tense quiet that follows conflict, but the natural stillness that comes when nothing is being tested anymore. The HOA didn't reach out again after the repaint was corrected. No follow-ups, no just checking in, no attempts to reassert involvement. It was as if the entire episode had been carefully folded away and stored where no one wanted to look at it. I continued reading the board minutes for a while, mostly out of curiosity. The language stayed cautious. Enforcement actions were softened. Procedures were emphasized. Where there had once been confidence, there was now restraint. They hadn't apologized publicly, but they had adjusted their behavior, and that told me everything I needed to know. People who believe they're untouchable don't change unless something forces them to. The neighbors' attitudes shifted too. Conversations became easier, less guarded. A few people admitted they'd worried about similar issues, but hadn't known how to push back without inviting retaliation. Others simply said they were glad someone had finally said no. I never framed it as a victory. I didn't need to. The result spoke for itself. What stayed with me most wasn't the repaint or the permit or even the HOA's retreat. It was how predictable the entire escalation had been once I looked at it clearly. The association acted because they assumed distance meant disengagement. They counted on inconvenience to do the enforcing for them. When that didn't work, their authority evaporated quickly. I didn't sue. I didn't make demands. I didn't raise my voice or threaten consequences. I documented, verified, and redirected the issue to the level where opinions stopped matching. The county didn't care about harmony or aesthetics or how confident the HOA sounded. They cared about rules, consent, and paper trails. That difference changed the outcome entirely. The house itself returned to blending into the landscape, exactly as it had before. From the road, it disappeared into the trees again, unremarkable and calm. That was the point. It was never meant to stand out as a statement. It was meant to be a place where control was clear and boundaries were respected. Every time I locked up and headed back down the mountain, I did so knowing that absence no longer created opportunity for anyone else. The HOA had learned that ownership didn't weaken when someone wasn't watching. If anything, it became more defensible when backed by preparation instead of reaction. Looking back, I realized the situation could have gone differently if I'd responded emotionally. If I'd argued first instead of researching. If I tried to reason with people who were never interested in discussion. Instead, I treated it like a systems problem, not a personal one. Once the right system was involved, the conflict resolved itself. There was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation, no public reckoning. Just a quiet correction and a lasting shift in behavior. The kind of ending that doesn't feel loud, but feels final. That mountain house taught me something I didn't expect to learn there. Control isn't maintained by being present all the time. It's maintained by knowing where authority actually lives and being willing to point to it calmly when someone forgets. Once that lesson was applied, the paint was just paint again, the house was just a house, and the silence returned to what it was always supposed to be.